There's a particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from running a marathon or pulling an all-nighter. It's quieter than that. It settles into your bones slowly, through 1,000 small moments where you said yes when every part of you was screaming no. You smiled through it. You showed up anyway. You gave more than you had. And then one day, you looked in the mirror and wondered where you went. If that feels familiar, this is for you. Today, we're going inside the psychology of people who struggle to say no, not because they're weak, not because they're naive, but because somewhere along the way, their nervous system learned that saying yes was the price of safety, love, and belonging. And understanding that is the first step toward something different. Let's start at the beginning, because almost nothing about our adult patterns begins in adulthood. For most people who can't say no, the roots stretch back to childhood. Maybe you grew up in a home where love felt conditional, where approval was something you earned through helpfulness, compliance, or emotional caretaking. Maybe the adults around you were unpredictable, and keeping the peace meant constantly reading the room and adjusting yourself to fit the mood. Or maybe you were simply praised so often for being good, easy, and no trouble at all that you internalized the belief that your value was tied to how little inconvenience you caused others. Psychologists call this the development of a fawn response, a survival strategy sitting alongside the more well-known fight, flight, and freeze. When a child learns that conflict is dangerous or that a caregiver's emotional state is their responsibility, they adapt. They become the accommodator. The peacekeeper. The one who anticipates needs before they're even voiced. And for a while, it works. It keeps them safe. It keeps the environment calm. It earns them warmth. The tragedy is that what begins as a brilliant adaptation becomes a prison in adulthood. Because the child grows up. The immediate danger fades. But the nervous system doesn't get that memo. It keeps operating on the same old programming: say yes to stay safe, say yes to be loved, say yes or risk losing connection entirely. So the adult version of that child walks through life in a state of chronic overextension, agreeing to commitments they dread, absorbing others' emotions like a sponge, unable to set a limit without a wave of guilt so strong it almost feels physical. And here's what makes it especially invisible: people who can't say no are often the most beloved people in any room. They're the reliable friend, the dependable colleague, the one everyone calls in a crisis. They're celebrated for their generosity. What nobody sees is the internal cost, the resentment quietly building underneath the smile, the anxiety that spikes every time a request comes in, the longing to just, for once, be the one whose needs come first. Let's talk about what this actually looks like day to day, because it rarely looks like someone lying prostrate under the weight of obligation. It's more subtle than that. It looks like staying late at work again because someone asked and you couldn't find the words to say you had plans. It looks like listening to a friend vent for 2 hours when you're already drowning, because you don't want to seem selfish. It looks like agreeing to attend a social event you've been dreading for weeks and then spending the entire drive there bargaining with yourself to survive it. It looks like a text message sitting in your drafts for 3 days, one you never sent, because it had the word no in it and you convinced yourself it would cause too much damage. It also lives in the body. Research in psychosomatic medicine has consistently shown that chronic people-pleasing is physically costly. The constant suppression of authentic needs activates the stress response over and over again, flooding the system with cortisol. Over time, this shows up as fatigue that sleep doesn't fix, persistent headaches, digestive problems, a lowered immune system, and a generalized sense of being depleted in a way that's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't felt it themselves. And then there's the relational cost, which is perhaps the most painful of all. When you cannot say no, your relationships are never fully real. Because the person others are relating to is a carefully curated, highly managed version of you, the version that is agreeable, accommodating, low maintenance. The real you, with actual preferences and actual limits, never quite shows up. This creates an aching loneliness even in the middle of full social calendars and close friendships. You are surrounded by people who appreciate you, but part of you suspects, correctly, that what they appreciate is what you do for them, not who you are beneath it. And paradoxically, the resentment that builds from this, resentment that feels shameful to even acknowledge, begins to quietly poison the very relationships you bent yourself to protect. You give until you're empty, and then the giving starts to feel like a violation of yourself, and eventually even the people you love can start to feel like threats to your well-being. Not because they are, but because you've never let them know what it actually costs you to show up the way you do. There's also a cognitive pattern worth naming here: the catastrophizing of consequences. Ask someone who struggles to say no what they're afraid will happen if they decline a request, and the answers are remarkably consistent. They'll be angry with me. They'll think I'm selfish. They'll leave. They'll never ask me again. The mind runs disaster scenarios with remarkable efficiency, projecting rejection, abandonment, and conflict onto situations that, in reality, would likely resolve with a simple "no problem, thanks anyway." The feared consequences are rarely proportionate to the actual risk. But because the nervous system has been conditioned to treat social disapproval as survival-level danger, the threat feels absolutely real. Understanding all of this, really sitting with it, should not produce shame. It should produce compassion. You were not broken into a people pleaser. You were shaped by experiences that made it the wisest available strategy. Your capacity for attunement, for generosity, for sensitivity to others' needs, these are genuine gifts. The work is not to dismantle them. The work is to stop letting them operate at the expense of yourself. And that work begins not with grand declarations or sudden confrontations, but with something quieter: learning to pause. To notice the automatic yes rising before you've even checked in with yourself. To ask, just for a moment, what do I actually want here? Not what would make this easier. Not what would make them happiest. What do you want? That pause is where everything changes. It's the space between stimulus and response where, slowly and with practice, your own voice begins to return to you. Boundaries are often talked about as walls, barriers that keep people out. But that's not really what they are. A boundary is simply a place where you end and someone else begins. It's not an act of cruelty. It's an act of honesty. And honesty, even uncomfortable honesty, is the foundation of any relationship worth having. When you say no genuinely, cleanly, without a 10-paragraph apology, you are not abandoning the people you love. You are inviting them to relate to who you actually are. That is a gift. To them, and far more urgently, to yourself. The person who learned to say yes to survive deserves to know that the danger has passed. That love is not something you have to earn through endless accommodation. That rest is not something you have to justify. That your needs are not a burden, they are simply human. Healing from this is not about becoming someone who says no all the time, who builds walls, who stops caring. It's about integration. It's about being someone who can say yes from a full place, because it's genuinely what you want, not because you're afraid of what happens if you don't. It's about learning that your presence, separate from your usefulness, is something worth showing up with. You have spent so long making room for everyone else. It's time to make a little room for yourself. And you can start quietly, gently, today.